For most of gaming history, playing meant sitting still. You played where the TV was, or you played where the power outlet was, and when you left the room, the game stayed behind. Handheld game consoles, though, changed all of that, so today, I want to take a look at some of the most important handheld gaming systems and how they gradually moved games out of the living room and more into our pockets. But before we do that, I think it's important to talk about what actually makes a video game console. At its simplest, a console is a device that can play multiple games on the same piece of hardware. And it might sound obvious now, but some of the earliest electronic games couldn't do that at all. Before handheld consoles existed, handheld games had to come first. And in the late 1970s, companies like Mattel were already experimenting with gaming on the go, so to speak. And these devices weren't really consoles in the modern sense, they were just games. Single games permanently built into their hardware, and what you brought is all they would ever do. This is what they look like. I've got two of them. These were actually part of my family. My dad and my uncle both used them. The football one here, this is American football, was used by my dad a whole lot. You can see as the label has rubbed off. And the baseball one, my understanding, was used by my uncle a whole lot. But in the 70s, this is what they had to play games. And you'll notice that they're not simulating any kind of something like Mario or Zelda. It's just regular sports games. There's no logic, there's no computers, there's no anything that we would consider a game. It's just the basic rules of whatever sports you were playing. But a lot of that was just a limitation of the time. If you were able to hardwire the rules of the game directly into these handhelds, it made them small, it made them durable, it made them instantly playable, and it made them cheap. These ran off of a 9-volt battery, and you could get a pretty good amount of playtime from them, but that was about it. And this is what really started the idea of playing some kind of game on the go. It wasn't until 1979 that something akin to what we know as a handheld console started to exist. It was called the Milton and Bradley Microvision. It was the first ever handheld console that had video game cartridges. This big brown part that you see in the picture actually came off, and the buttons, the game data, and everything that it would need to actually play it would just swap out and you could put a new one in. But it was really, really limited, and a lot of the stuff was still simulating board games instead of sports, whereas this is doing football or baseball. The ones that the Microvision would do would be closer to Battleship or something like that. For handheld gaming to move forward, the game had to stop being hardware and it needed to become software. The idea of games becoming software instead of hardware wasn't really solved until 1989, and the company that figured it out was Nintendo, and they started it with the Game Boy. Most people know about this, and a lot of people have had them. This was their first ever handheld console, and it absolutely revolutionized really gaming in general, not just gaming on the go. And what made the Game Boy so revolutionary was where Nintendo put its priorities. This isn't a huge powerhouse, it's actually kind of underpowered for what was available at the time, but you'll notice that the screen is kind of a greenish color. That's because it's actually a monochrome screen. There's no color here. You get darker green on light green. If I can turn it on, I can show you. That Nintendo logo, there we go. That's what the screen looks like, and it is just as bad to play as you think it is. I've got two lights currently that are illuminating my desk right here, but it is just as aggravating as it kind of looks on camera. And on the side here, we've got a little contrast wheel. Let me see if I can look through the lens and figure out what's going on. There we go. That's a good image for it. So imagine having to do that to play your Call of Duties and your Fortnites, having to adjust a contrast wheel, and we got our sound over here. And this is Tetris, of course, the pack-in game that came with it, and one of the best games ever made. But you'll notice that the priority of the Game Boy wasn't to be some big powerhouse and change computing forever. It was just to get games in people's hands. The Game Boy, original Game Boy, ran on 4 AA's, and you'd get well over 20 hours of battery life from that, playing whatever game you could think of. The pack-in title was Tetris, but not to mention Pokemon, one of the biggest franchises on the planet, started on the Game Boy. It started on these right here. And what's really so important about bringing up this device as the first generation of handheld gaming is that this made handheld gaming stop being a novelty. It wasn't something that you picked up and played on the car ride. This was something that people would play at their homes when they wanted to. This was what they took, quote unquote, seriously for their gaming. For the first time, handheld gaming stopped being a novelty and started to look like a platform. You didn't really just own a game, you had a system, and the system could grow over time. We can see that with the Game Boy Color, and the Game Boy Pocket, the Game Boy Light. The Pocket and Light were exclusive to Japan, but still, there was innovation, there was change. They were making this platform better. And not to mention, it was designed around how people could actually carry and use a handheld. Sure, pocketable is the word that people think of for portable things, and this certainly would only fit in, you know, the pocket of parachute pants. But when you look at some of the revisions, one of the big revisions was this. This is the Game Boy Color, and you'll notice that the screen is a little bit different color. That's because this is a color screen. It's not backlit, but if we turn it on here, look, see, you got that little rainbow of color going on. I don't know if it's going to launch the game, it might not, but you can just see how much clearer that is. And these were pretty cheap, just like the original Game Boy, and they ran off of batteries just the same. 2 AA's this time, get about 15 hours is what I've heard. I haven't really put them to the test. But the wealth of games and content that you could have on these little devices was just incredible. And innovating even further into what I would call the 1.5 gen of handheld gaming was the Game Boy Advance. This is a Game Boy Micro, not a fantastic example, but this was kind of a portable Super Nintendo. I call it a 1.5 generation because it's not really changing a whole lot of how people played. It's still the same layout, D-pad, 2 buttons, and your kind of basic games, but this really did bring things to a new generation of people. The Game Boy Advance is often treated as a new generation, but it's better understood as the final refinement of the original Game Boy philosophy. It brought a lot more power, better visuals, more complex games, but it didn't really change what handheld gaming was. Battery life was still the main focus, cartridges are still what defined the platform, and portability meant designing within some pretty strict limits. What's interesting to me, though, about the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance is that they didn't really have a meaningful rival. Nintendo had already solved the core problem of handheld gaming, and the rest of the industry wasn't really offering a different answer. You had some competitors, the main one being the Atari Lynx, but that one was way too expensive, way too battery hungry, and just didn't have an install base that could work around a lot of the limitations and a lot of what the Game Boy offered at such a cheaper price. For me, a lot of what the Game Boy Advance represents is a ceiling, and one that had to be passed for any kind of handheld gaming to progress in a really, really meaningful way. Fast forward to the mid-2000s, and like I said, handheld gaming had reached a bit of a ceiling. Power alone really wasn't enough to move things forward, and refining the Game Boy idea and the Game Boy platform was starting to get stale. And you had a second generation of handhelds emerge when companies started asking different questions. Not really how to make the handheld stronger, but how to make them different. One of the big things that allowed them to change this idea of how you could use a handheld was rechargeable batteries. That Game Boy Micro, it had a rechargeable battery in it, so did the Game Boy Advance SP, but all of the handhelds that came before it ran off of batteries. They ran off of AA's, some of them ran off of AAA's. The Atari Lynx that I had mentioned earlier ran off of 6 D-cell batteries. 6 D-cells, and it drained them in 3 hours. That is the same battery life that a Nintendo Switch base model would get playing Breath of the Wild, and something that was running 16-bit games could only do it for 3 hours on 6 D-cells. I don't think I'm ever going to get over that. But back on topic. The idea of handhelds was changing into not really making them stronger, but making them different. Nintendo's answer, you know it, you love it, you probably had 3 growing up. The DS. Oh man, this is such a hoss whenever it comes to raising a generation on video games. I have put so much time into my DS. This isn't my original one. The original one that I played on was actually my mother's, because she would play Lego Indiana Jones. This is one that I picked up at a used game store a while back, but it still works. It's got a great screen. Oh, love that. Gotta love the intro chime for the DS. The big thing that the DS brought to the table wasn't just increasing power, it was changing how people interacted with the games. The big deal was this second screen down here. Having it be a touchscreen and being able to do things with it is what made it more interesting, and it allowed developers, especially Nintendo, to change not only what the console could do, but how the players interacted with it. So much of the second screen wasn't really about spectacle, it was about reducing complexity. If you've ever played Mario Kart or any kind of open world game on the DS, a lot of the second-hand information goes onto the bottom screen. Mario Kart has your map. One of my favorite games was Kingdom Hearts, and the 2 Kingdom Hearts games that were on this, they had your map or they had some kind of abilities. So much of what you needed to optimize, quote-unquote, your gaming sessions were just relegated to the second screen. It was a pretty interesting design philosophy, but it wasn't the only philosophy that showed up, because for the first time, Nintendo had a rival. That rival was Sony, and in 2006, they revealed the PSP, the PlayStation Portable. And when I talk about philosophy, we'll turn it on here and take a look at it. The DS was strictly a gaming machine. You would plug in your cartridge or your Game Boy cartridge, depending on which one you had, and you would play your game, and that was about it. When you were done, you would close the clamshell and move on. But the PSP was trying to be something very different. It's not turning on. That's not good. There we go. Had me scared for a second there. But you'll notice, if you've ever played on the PlayStation 3, this is going to look very similar, because this is not just a game system. This was supposed to be a completely multimedia device in your pocket. 2006, and you have something that can play video games that are almost the same quality as a full PlayStation 2. You have an internet browser, you could watch movies, music, it had a camera attachment. So much of this was trying to be a multimedia device that you could carry anywhere, and it really did work. A lot of it was limited by the form factor and the way the games worked. They were on discs called UMDs, which really did hinder the system a lot. But it was so revolutionary and such a powerhouse for the time. When you had the DS, which most of the games were peaking at looking like a PlayStation 1 game, and this was almost a full fat PS2 in your pocket that could do so many other things, it's so hard to convey just how big of a deal this system was. Nintendo's approach was refining the experience and making it something that you could just pick up and play. Sony didn't just want to give you a gaming device, they wanted to give you a console. Like I said earlier, if you've ever used a PS3, this is going to look really familiar to you, because it's basically the PlayStation 3 UX. That's exactly what it is. It's the UI of the PS3 that they shrunk down to something this small. Absolutely fantastic. This thing prioritized visual fidelity, immersive, full 3D games, and the multimedia. It felt less like a toy, and it was a portable entertainment system. And if you ask me, what really separates this from the Game Boy as a second generation is that it isn't so important as to which system won. I mean, it's obvious the DS is the second best selling game console of all time, but it split handheld gaming into two very, very distinct philosophies. The DS was optimized for accessibility and interaction, hugely reliant on pick up and play. The PSP was presentation and immersion and doing other things. You had thousands of fully fledged movies, like theater release movies that you could get on a UMD, drop it into this very complicated looking thing, and it is complicated. I've taken one of these apart. Oh my god, it's so intimidating. This really did signify a fork in the road. You had the more premium philosophy versus strictly focusing on gaming. But moving on, let's take a look at what I would call the third generation of handheld gaming. And these handhelds really arrived at a different landscape. We're talking about the early 2010s here, and portable gaming wasn't a niche anymore. It was everywhere. And it wasn't on the devices that you would expect. It was on your phone, your smartphone. This is an iPhone 5C, something like that, not important. Anyway, smartphones had quietly taken over all of the spaces that dedicated handhelds were designed for. So much of the audience that wanted to have a DS or wanted to have a PSP just kind of moved on to the phone. This was whenever phones were getting powerful enough to run fully fledged games, and some of them were pretty lackluster. This isn't a great example because a lot of the stuff that would work on here doesn't compare to games nowadays, but back then it was worth it. Instead of spending $100, $200 on a device that could play video games, why not just download something on your phone? Moments that handhelds had been built for, things like waiting rooms and bus rides and little short breaks that you had, they weren't really able to compete with something like this. This was already in your pocket. You didn't have to buy anything else. You just go to the App Store, download whatever kind of free apps that you needed to kill time with, and you were done. But that didn't stop Nintendo and Sony from trying. In the early 2010s, Nintendo's answer was the 3DS. This is a later model of it, not a great example, but regardless, it proves the point. The 3DS was Nintendo still experimenting. They went with a glasses-free 3D design that was supposed to make it a lot better and more immersive and more interesting to play your games. It, as far as I know, really just gave people a lot of headaches. But despite the novelty, the 3DS relied on familiar strengths. It was Nintendo's flagship console at the time. It was approachable. It had a very approachable design, simple clamshell, just turn the power button on and go. Built around an ecosystem of old games. There was an entire eShop that you could download games off of, which is the big thing that separates this generation from the others. This was the internet age. This was the time when you could put your credit card details into something, buy a game, download it all on the system, and never have to go anywhere. It was limited still because storage capacity hadn't really caught up with what we have today, but it was the first generation to try. I remember downloading things onto my 3DS. That's where I first played Pokemon Yellow, was on my original 3DS. I downloaded it off of the eShop and I played the hell out of that game. I loved it. And that's what really gave the 3DS so much of an edge, was that it could play 30 years worth of Nintendo's lineup, especially these new models. The new 3DS, which is totally not confusing at all for anyone in a store, but besides the point, could play anything from the NES all the way up to the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy Advance. And even if you were able to mod it, you were able to do a whole lot more. And that really did give it an edge over something like your phone, because if you wanted a dedicated machine to play Zelda and Mario and Donkey Kong and Metroid or Fire Emblem even, this was your guy, which is why the 3DS was so popular for its time. You had all of those backlogs of games that you could play digitally and your own backlogs. This thing is fully compatible with the original DS. All of the games work on it. It's not region locked. You can play any DS game from any region and be perfectly fine. It really did garner an audience from people who just wanted to continue playing the same system they had before. But when I said it didn't stop them from trying, it's because Sony was still in the game at this point. In around 2013, they released the PlayStation Vita, which was the successor to the PSP, and you'll notice that because the big difference is it has a second analog stick. That was the biggest criticism of the PSP. Had fully 3D games, but really bad camera controls, and this is what was the answer to it. Dual analog sticks, as I said, more powerful hardware, and the Vita really did push further towards console quality experiences on the go. Most of the people who have used one of these will tell you that it's pretty similar to like a PS3 in your pocket. I realized I've been trying to turn it on the whole time. That's what this finger was doing, and I was pressing the volume and not the power. Anyway, so as I was saying, the PS Vita was very technically impressive, and it even had this touchpad back here. Part of the PS4 controller, you know, it has like the touchpad. Part of that was from this. That's part of where that DNA came from. And also, the idea that you could mirror your console. You could play your PS4 in the palm of your hands, kind of, by streaming it wirelessly. It was a pretty cool idea. I find these things wildly uncomfortable. That's part of why I haven't put a whole lot of time into them, because this flat edge and then the curves going around like that, I don't know, it's not great. I got big hands too, and it's not the greatest. But I mean, this is a pretty premium console here, if I can get the touchscreen to work. Hello? 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 Vita. Doesn't want to play ball today, but that's all right. I was getting off topic anyway, because one of the things that really defined the third generation wasn't just the fact that they could go on the internet and do everything wirelessly. It was their modding scene. Both of these guys have gotten a second life in the idea of jailbreaking your system and getting a bunch of custom software on it and making it personalized, making it more you. And that's really awesome. That's really cool. Nintendo especially has been really cracking down on it, and they're not a huge fan of it. I don't think Sony really cares about this anymore. They don't really talk about it. Most people don't. A lot of people didn't even know it existed. But the 3DS especially, the idea that you could have so many generations of Nintendo games all on one device really did make a huge deal when they broke the software and were able to get whatever they wanted on it. Even stuff like Sega Genesis, Sega Game Gear, Atari stuff, you can load all of those emulators straight onto here and have a blast. There it is. I got it. There we go. So yeah, PS Vita home software, pretty cool. Great little music, great little jingle that they have going on. But like I said, modding community. You throw a SD card into a little adapter here, move some files around, and you've got every Vita game that was ever made, any kind of emulator you want to play. And this right here, a full-fledged PSP built right in here. Sony made the software to play a couple PSP games, and people took it and ran with it. You have a PS Vita and a PSP all in one. And the coolest thing about it, it works with PlayStation portable multiplayer games. Like wirelessly multiplayer, this works with it. It sends out a signal just the same. It's so cool. But getting back on topic, both systems were very, very strong in their own right, but never really We're able to fully reclaim the handheld gaming time slot because phones had just become such a dominant force and we're advancing so much, and it was the smartphone wars. So many different companies were all putting a hand in, trying to make new smartphones, trying to make a flagship, trying to carve out their own piece, and now we're really left with Apple, Samsung, and Google, in America at least, and that's really it. And those things are so powerful nowadays that having a dedicated handheld really is not super viable unless you're an enthusiast, and that's kind of where these have landed up. They're enthusiast consoles, and really bastions of preservation for not only handheld gaming, but just gaming in general, as really, really cool historical consoles, if you wanted to call them that. If you want to know the history of a franchise, especially Nintendo, I wager you could get all of it working on one of these, and you could keep it in your bag or in your pocket and go on about your day. Whenever you have time, you could just gradually eat away at it. And for someone who likes collecting games and loves games as an art and a passion, it's still really cool to see how dedicated these communities are at keeping these consoles alive. But moving on from those, we go into what I would call the fourth generation. This generation really wasn't trying to reclaim the time slot that the phones had taken over. It really wasn't trying to be some underpowered thing that you could pop out every once in a while and doodle on, because that really wasn't going to take over you playing Candy Crush or doom scrolling Facebook all day. What handheld gaming really needed to do at the time was change. No longer could you get away with offering middle-of-the-road pick-up-and-play experiences as much. You had to offer something big that would entice people to buy the system. One of the big philosophical change in sales was now you weren't going after people's free time, you had to go after their major time. The major time that they spend on gaming, you had to capture and you had to justify being there. And in 2020, Nintendo was the first to give the answer and really to prove the point. And they did it with the Switch. The Nintendo Switch is such a beloved console, beloved by many. I love it myself personally. The reason the Switch changed the game was because you didn't have to change the game. Everything that you needed on a console was here. It was full-fat console experiences on the go. Battery life was a bit of an issue. Like I said earlier, you're looking about like 3 hours on the base model. This is the OLED, so it gets better battery life. But still, if you're out and about, more than 3 hours straight of game time really isn't going to happen, and when you're done, you just come home, take the Joy-Cons off, or connect a controller, and you're playing the same thing you were earlier on your couch now, where you're more comfortable. It was the same game, it was the same save file, and the same controls that moved freely from TV into your handheld. And when I said earlier that the Nintendo Switch proved the point, it really did prove that people are willing to spend the money and commit the time to something that can give them the proper experience on the go if it's worth it, if it's powerful enough. And the Switch wasn't. The Switch was pretty underpowered whenever it first came out. I remember very distinctly playing Breath of the Wild on the original Switch and thinking, wow, this game could really use a resolution bump, it could really use a frame rate bump, it could really use all of these minor niggling little points that would make it so much better, but it was so good enough that it was fine. And it opened the door to a whole new class of handhelds, which were full-fat consoles in your hand. When I look back on the Switch, so many things that I see about it are a proof of concept that you could even do that to begin with. But the device that really did push it to the forefront and finalize the idea and perfect it, if you will, is this. Valve's Steam Deck. This has removed so many of the traditional limitations of a handheld console. This isn't just a device specifically made to play one company's games like the Switch. This is a PC. Granted, it runs Linux, but hey, Linux is pretty cool. Everything that you have on your Steam library, on your computer, which the computer has been dominating the gaming market for so many years now, can just come into the palm of your hand. The Steam Deck was unprecedented openness and power. It is absolutely incredible and so poetic that it was done by Valve, which so many people view as a company that they're not going to do anything unless they can change the game. And change the game, they did. Unfortunately though, the Steam Deck wasn't designed for everyone. With all of its power and freedom, it also had a couple new trade-offs, mainly in size. This is a lot bigger than something like a 3DS. Let me see. This is a new 3DS XL and it is the size of the Steam Deck's screen. That should be pretty telling in how big this is, and should be even more telling as to how the philosophy is now changing again. This isn't designed for everyone. This is designed for people who want to game. And that's really what defined this entire fourth generation. The Switch and the Steam Deck are pretty big. They're not pocketable anymore. They go in your bag, they go in a suitcase, or they live as a console. attached to your TV that you take off whenever you're going somewhere. The idea of handheld changed from replacing console gaming and taking up the free time that you had to removing location as a main constraint. Now, you don't have to worry about where the power outlet is. You don't have to worry about where the TV is. Everything that you need is right contained in here and with very little compromise. These new devices, this new generation, will have you covered, because it's not just the Steam Deck. You've got the Steam Deck, you've got the Switch 2 has now come out, you've got Ambernic, which are making so many different devices that are focused on emulation instead of really hardcore PC gaming. You've got the ROG Ally, you've got the Lenovo Legion Go, you've got the Xbox ROG Ally X, which is arguably the most confusing name for a console, but it's Microsoft, that's kind of what they do. It's kind of a new industry, and it's pretty exciting to see how everything is changing. I think it's telling that so many of the other devices are either more expensive than the Steam Deck and have many more compromises, or are different in some way, but don't really compete with the value that the Steam Deck offers. So, to wrap it up, when you're thinking about handheld gaming as an evolution, as a story, you tend to think of it about smaller devices and more powerful hardware, but what really shaped it were compromises, battery life, screens, cost, the time that people had. Over time, handhelds stopped being about filling spare moments and started being about removing location as a limit altogether. And while the devices have changed dramatically over time, the underlying question has always stayed the same, and that is, where do games belong? The answer was never in just one place, it was wherever the players were willing to take them.